Cool. Okay, so I'm an interaction designer, so I come from a slightly different background from, I'm guessing, a lot of you guys. Any other interaction designers or UX designers in the audience? No, just me then. Okay, so I kind of advocate for the user. It's all about making sure that, as Dan mentioned earlier, when we're looking for those friction points, what are they? And actually, are we building systems and pieces that are going to be beneficial for them and kind of go towards their needs? So I'm going to take you through a few things. It's going to be quite fast. I'm going to try and do 3 case studies. We'll see how we get on for time. But I'm going to be talking about kind of how the world has changed and why that means it's really important to actually understand the context behind the way that people are behaving, and actually understanding a bit more kind of about either behavioural sciences or design research to kind of get those pieces into your work as well. We'll be looking at a framework that I use quite often in lots of different projects that kind of helps make sure that you're framing it from lots of different angles, so you have that more complete picture. And there'll be a few case studies, and then we'll just kind of talk about issues with the framework and little struggles that I've had kind of implementing it. So in terms of how we're thinking about the world today, obviously there's an incredible amount of data now created, logged and processed each day. I think one of the core things that we do a lot when we're looking from a design point of view is actually data visualization. So this is just a quick one around kind of how workers in New York are spending their time and moving around. And as we know, we actually have that computational power to actually do a lot more with the information that we're gathering from people. So not only do we know who they are, where they are, and kind of what systems they're interacting on, we can actually use that data to create highly advanced systems that are personalized and tailored almost to an audience of one. So in terms of this, data is really, really great for spotting those patterns, and actually kind of that visualization really clearly showed when people were at work, when they were moving between the offices, what sort of interest they had. But often it actually lacks the context of the reason why someone's doing it. And one of the pieces that kind of is a core part of that is around the need for actually storytelling. And I think it was Daniel Kahneman, where I mentioned behavioural science before. He's obviously one of the big people within that field, but he sort of said it really well, that no one's ever made a decision based on a number. They need a story. So numbers on their own aren't actually giving us that context. We need to kind of become more interested in things that are kind of around human empathy, vulnerability, fear, greed, love, intimacy, all these things that are actually the core behaviours that are driving what we're seeing. So we see them in terms of patterns, but actually what's going on for those people and how do we get more understanding of them. So kind of in terms of what's going on in the world, I'll just sort of frame it up a little bit. This pretty much sums it up for me. We went from 10 years ago, everyone's scared of strangers on the internet. You don't really want to like interact with people. It's scary to meet them in real life. They might be really weird. Now we just summon them to take us around and bring us food. We go on dates with them. We're completely like fine with that sort of interaction. And it's actually, we've got this trust in the systems and the platforms and services are in place. It's not that our human trust in people has changed, it's just that we're willing to put our trust in a service or a platform. So it's like this really weird situation when you sort of think back to even 10 to 15 years ago. People are also, they have a much higher expectation of what you're doing. I think this is kind of a really good illustration of that, is that everyone pretty much wants what they want when they want it, and they want it now, and they want it fast, and they want it cheap, and they don't really have that same loyalty that they used to kind of brand affiliation. And we're moving beyond that world of where kind of you had a lifetime game of engaging with customers. You need to continuously be sort of producing things that they're going to be interested in and want. And that's kind of down to the experience expectations. So this is a framework that we use quite often when we're actually doing competitor analysis. So we start off with the direct competitors, we move up to kind of the experiential competitors, and then all the way up to perceptual. So experiential competitors is in terms of services that could replace yours. So if you're, for example, a bank, things like Apple Pay may be replacing you. They're doing parts of your service that you would have once had a monopoly over, but actually people can find these much faster and easier ways to actually do those interactions now. And the perceptual competitors is one that's the most difficult. This is kind of everything else that's out there. It's the world that we're living in now. It's things like Amazon, Uber, Netflix. It's actually that expectation that you can have things so much in your own sort of realm, so much tailored for you, that if something doesn't work as well or as fast as that, you suddenly think there's something wrong with that service. And actually, To reach that level is incredibly difficult. And we're trying to do it across multiple touch points, so it's getting even more complicated. And we're sort of striving for this thing around kind of this audience of one, and actually always sort of our communications, our services, our systems being built around that. And this is something that we call living services. So it's an area that we work on a lot. It's to try and kind of prepare people for the changing future, and actually using a lot of the technologies that we have now mixed with human understanding to actually create these systems. The fly in the ointment is people, because to be honest, we are irrational, we behave strangely, we don't always behave as you would expect us to. So actually understanding what environment someone might be in, is it neat, is it clean, is it messy, have they got a child screaming in the background when they're kind of using the pieces that you're putting out there, is really important to actually designing things that are for them. So this is kind of the framework to get that context together. So you're combining big data or quant data. It might be more survey-based data. It might not necessarily actually be full big data. You use thick data, which is design research or qualitative-based data systems, and then wide data, which is actually about understanding the whole landscape. So it's looking at trend analysis, forecasting, and actually what's going on in the world around you. And by combining these three different types, you can actually have a full view of kind of the macro level of what's happening in the world today, how does that affect the people that we're working with, on a micro level of who are our users, what are their emotional motivations, and kind of if there is more trends analysis about what's going on and you have big data sets to work with, how can you actually map those different patterns that you're seeing in there to those behaviours and to the needs of the customers that you're trying to serve. And if we combine all of those things together, it kind of gives us that context, and it comes down to the core why. So thick data techniques are very much based around user interviews. This is the area that I'm most comfortable with. It's basically going down, meeting people, sometimes following them around, which seems a little bit weird, but it's actually a really good way to actually understand them. And it's all about getting behind what they're saying and understanding what is that motivation that's driving them that they're not actually necessarily able to articulate. And it's about framing conversations or actually studying them over a period of time, or asking them to study themselves over a period of time to actually get that type of information from them. In terms of sort of quantitative data or big data that we tend to use, it might be things kind of around demographics and census data. It might be sentiment analysis across social. More often than not, we'll be looking at search trends and how people are actually consuming media behaviours. So a lot of the work that I used to do was based on publishers or cultural sectors, so it was really important to understand what types of content people wanted to consume, where they wanted to consume it, and actually why they were doing it. And then kind of in terms of the more wide data pieces, so there's traditional competitor analysis, so that may also include kind of SWOT analysis of yourselves. There are industry trends, how is it changing, who's kind of coming in, who are the new players that are kind of causing issues within the industry, or who's innovating very, very quickly. We also have those more perceptual and experiential competitors, and then pestle analysis, which gets called loads of different things, and the acronym gets turned around different ways, but it's basically looking at politics, economics, social trends, technological trends, legal and environmental trends, so you understand the world across a variety of different pieces. So I'm going to go into a couple of the case studies now. So each one is about a different type of data, although all three types of data get used in them. So in terms of this one, it was really kind of about understanding how people felt about money. In the UK, money is really awkward to talk about, and so we really wanted to get behind how are people making decisions around money? How do people really feel when they're getting their paychecks? What's going on in terms of decision making when they decide, do I save? Do I just spend it all right now? Am I kind of one of those people who's just kind of going along and hasn't got a long-term plan? So to do this, we kind of used a lot more ethnographic models. We had a much larger data set than we tend to go for, so it was based over a longer period of time, I think for around a month or so. And one of the insights that triggered it, a lot of the clients that we work with are kind of in the banking sector, which is an area that is being kind of decimated in terms of the new startups. You've got fintechs, you've got neobanks, and then you also have these changing expectations people have kind of around services and around money. And there was a report that came out a few years ago that sort of triggered this piece of research that was called the Millennial Disruption Index. And it was kind of looking at what people thought across a wide range on, people not actually really trusting in banks, not understanding them, and millennials believing that 33%, which for me is actually quite high and 5 years isn't very long, believe that they wouldn't need a bank within the next 5 years. They believe that other services would replace them. So then when we put the framework in place kind of around all these different competitors, obviously we have direct competitors, different banks that are in the sector, you have different payment models that are available, and now you have a lot more of the fintechs and neobanks, so things like Monzo. I think at the moment probably anyone who works in that area has got people saying, but we want to be like Monzo, but for the mass market. It's kind of one of those benchmarks that's coming up again and again. And then you sort of have the perceptual pieces, so Amazon, so can you do like Amazon checkout, or Facebook, where we actually do have services to sell things. So what we came up with was a piece of research called Money Mindsets. It was based on, as I said, a large-scale diary study, 50 plus participants. There's a set of user interviews and observations. So once we'd done the large-scale study, it allowed us to kind of put a framework in place that we then wanted to test. And in design research, it's not necessarily about the amount of people you're doing, it's about the quality of the small target offering that you go for. And actually at a certain point, you start to hear the same things repeatedly. So if you've done your targeting kind of well, hopefully you've kind of covered all the bases that you wanted to. And there are 4 key areas that we were looking to understand. The first one was, when do you think about money? Second, where do you think about money? How hard do you think about money, and where's your bank in that moment? So this also gave us a really good idea of where we needed to do the interviews when we actually went out and speak to people. It was really important that we did it in the context of where they were thinking about money, so we could kind of be with them in that actual real setup. Because a lot of the time when you're doing kind of user research, if it's usability, obviously you're in a lab, but when you're doing more generative type research where you're trying to get behind people's mental models, it's really useful to actually be in the places that they would be, so that you can understand actually what that environment is like for them as well. So this kind of ranged from people who were newly independent to empty nesters. There were 2 universal truths that came out. Banking being misaligned with today's customers, not that surprising, I guess, in terms of kind of a piece of insight, but the research actually bore it out. So again, it's something that you see kind of that you have a feeling about, and then through the research we were able to actually back up. And this is due to a misconception people have about motivations. It's actually about how they feel of trust in banks. So for them, banks are more about products and people are more about the way they're treated. And there is a problem with that trust equation that's kind of gone wrong for the banks at the moment. And we also kind of have the issue that segmentation strategies. So I think finance and banking is very comfortable with segmenting people, say, by income and actually by demographics, whereas those aren't actually necessarily the way that people are behaving now and thinking about money. It's much more about actually the motivations behind it, and you can't just split down by pure demographics anymore. So these are the 4 mindsets. So they range from being a highly structured view of kind of money, which is I think about the bigger picture, I can plan for it, I have an understanding of where I want to go, all the way down to I'm just in the moment, I make decisions as they come up. On the other scale, it's I'm all about instinct, I just do gut feeling, if it feels right for me, I'm going to go there. And then on the other side, you kind of follow the rules. So tried and tested, this is how my parents managed money, this is how I will manage money. So the first mindset is called achievers. They're very clear about their budgeting and they're actually able to achieve their goals. So there are a lot of people who may have aspirational goals, but this is actually about being able to put the plan in place and actually follow through on it. And that's something quite different from necessarily having that higher picture. So that's kind of what distinguishes them from, say, the explorers. So the explorers are more able to make a trade-off, so they can be happy. So it's for them, happiness is the key part of it, and money is not necessarily the factor in that. They're actually looking more on how you use money to build your happiness. Then we have balancers, so they are all about kind of getting the best deal. So just think of them as the deal seekers, what's in it for me sort of mindset. And then you have experiencers. So these are people who define success by living in the present, by enjoying the present, and their decisions are very much based on what can I have now, what's my immediate need. So that kind of gives you a good picture of that piece of research. So when we're actually going into projects with finance clients, this gives us a really good basis for actually understanding core motivations across a large population. Obviously, depending on the client, their user groups are slightly different, so then this gets applied in different ways. But in terms of a framework for thinking about money in general and people's experiences, this kind of covers off the general sort of motivations. And then from here, you can actually sort of define feature sets and different ways to interact with these people that will actually help them achieve their goals. So one of the most difficult bits when we're starting a project is actually defining the type of research that we need. It can be a little bit tricky because there are so many different ways that you can do it. So interviewing is obviously one of the core methods that we use, but it's not always the best way to get it. So sometimes it really depends on what the outcome that you need. So this is just a quick sort of model to explain that. So the first bit about determining the goal of research, I've got like a little cheat sheet that I'll take you through in a minute that defines it based on actually the needs of your project and where you want to go. The second core bit that we put in place, so this is kind of the method to work through, is actually what's your core question? What's the core thing that you're actually trying to answer? The one base thing that if you don't get the answer to this question, your piece of research hasn't actually succeeded. Then we look at the methodology to actually be able to achieve it. Any practical issues, so that's about logistics. It might be that you're going after a very niche user base. Not many of them exist, so they're very difficult to contact, so you need to find a different way to actually recruit them. Obviously, then you need to decide how to actually deal with the issue. So, for example, if it's a very niche audience, but you know that they spend a lot of time in a particular place online, you can try and recruit through those places. And then the last key bit, which is actually about the evaluation and turning it into insights. And the most important bit about that is actionable insights. So often we'll get loads of really lovely findings, but if they're not actionable right now, we need to make sure we put a plan in place to action them in the near future. Because there's no point doing research all up front. It needs to kind of be actionable soon. So it's making sure that you're almost doing those, I guess it's the like minimum amount of research at each stage that will give you the answer you need to progress with your piece. So in terms of determining the goal, for me, you kind of can segment between a large established company or a small company and a startup. Their kind of aims and goals tend to be slightly different in what they're doing. And they range along from innovation to kind of continuous improvement. So depending on whether you are actually looking to improve the thing that you have or if you're looking for a new sector to move into, the type of research that you want to be doing is actually quite different. So if you're an established company and you're wanting to do innovation, the most important bit for you is actually to understand the users. You're less likely to be close to them. So for a startup, for example, often they're actually, the founders have a real core interest in the work that they're doing, so they intrinsically may understand the users more. So for them, it's about validating what they have assumed about the users, whereas for a large company, it's actually about understanding who the target audience could even be, and it might be a much broader kind of piece. These are kind of the different methods that you can actually do to do it. So we talk about generative, evaluative, and validation. So generative is about generating new ideas. It's about looking at opportunity spaces. It's less structured and less guided. Evaluative is more about things like usability testing, so actually comparing one thing to another. It may even go down to A/B testing. Validation itself may be around product market fit and actually how much is it going to cost us to build this thing? Are there enough users who will use it? And if so, what would they pay for it? And these are quite different types of research that we use depending on there. And then there's some different bits in there like SWOT analysis, product market fit, for that actually evaluating your knowledge piece. So we have the same problem as data science, so we have a lot of bias in what we're doing. The key bit is to try and watch out for both researcher bias and user bias. So researcher bias is if I have an assumption about people going into a research study, I'm very likely to be able to prove it out because I'll select the pieces of information that prove my hypothesis is true. So you kind of have to make sure you sense check. So we tend to work in pairs to try and reduce that amount of bias. And then user bias, which is the nice one, which is called friendliness bias. And that is where people will want to tell you what you want to hear. They're there to kind of give you feedback, and it can be very difficult to get people to say negative things about the product that you're working on. This case study is a little bit more on the big data side, and it's actually about a mining company. So it's probably a little bit similar, but I will play the video and then talk you through it. Okay, we have no sound. Okay. All right, so basically it's a large drilling company. They were looking for a way to actually do to train new engineers and make sure that they had all the data available, very similar to some of the stuff that Dan was talking about. So this is the kind of visualization that we did for it. So a very similar process. We went out and spoke to people, kind of understood what environment that they're working in. It's a very busy, noisy environment. This was all about actually visualizing that data to make sure that it was as easy as possible for people to pull out those key insights that they needed to make decisions. So these are some of the different bits of the interface. So there's lots of different schematics and views to actually make sure that they have as much information as possible. And again, it's basically processing a huge amount of data, so they had to build it using a gaming engine, and it's effectively very similar to actually a video game. So again, one of the things that I'm super interested in is how sci-fi and gaming actually reflects in user experience design. It's one of the things you see again and again. Sci-fi is basically becoming real, and all of these things that we see as future forecasting are kind of there. So I think it's a really good actually inspiration model for the way that we're doing products and services. So yeah, it was about a game. The client actually said to us, when does Alien come through the screen? They were super excited about it. All the real-time data is being processed, and it's kind of appearing so quickly that they felt it was like more like a video game. And it basically enabled less experienced drillers to work safely and efficiently. So I will, this one I'll not dwell too long on because it's not my area of expertise as much. Wide data is something that I am much more comfortable with. So this is one of the key bits that I do at the start of every project and kind of throughout a project to make sure that it's going to be tracking properly against kind of competitors. So this is all about understanding the industry that you're working in, understanding wider trends within the world, and actually kind of making sure that you understand how you fit within that and how your users fit within that. So the projects I'm going to talk to you about, the brief, it only came in a couple of weeks ago, so it's super new, but it was basically about predicting the future, which I don't know if anyone's ever done any forecasting or future trend analysis work. Yeah, cool. So yeah, you'll be familiar with the future cone, the like cone of almost, not shame or uncertainty, but effectively there are probable futures, possible futures, and then it kind of goes out into the extremes. So what we were looking at was only 10 to 15 years in the future. So it's not actually that far away. And obviously, as you know, forecasting is much easier the closer you are to it. So I can predict something for next year much more readily than I can predict for now. One of the interesting things kind of about working on this type of trend prediction was it's as much an art as a science. So we're kind of gathering our very similar to the work that we were doing kind of when we do user research interviews. We're gathering those emotional responses and gathering those pieces and signals that we're seeing that are a little bit less tangible and sense checking against data that we're seeing out there and looking at research papers and different wider sort of world views on that. So this was for an architectural and engineering firm, and they kind of wanted to know what would the city look like and how are people going to be living in cities in 10 to 15 years' time to make sure that they were employing the right people now and building up those skill sets to kind of enable their business going forward. So for that, we kind of did a trend forecasting model where you take basic needs. So when you're thinking about people, basic needs are kind of warmth, food, society, love, things like that. For the city, they're slightly different, so they may be about infrastructure or food supply, and actually making sure your built environment is resilient. Then we look at drivers of change or trends, so these are things, they might be long macro changes like an aging population, or smaller ones, such as political events or economic shocks that actually happen. And then we're looking at innovations. That might be new businesses, or it might be emerging technologies. So we kind of put all of these things together and did, to generate the trends, we did pestle analysis. So as I said, this goes across politics, economics, social science, technology, legal, and environmental. And we produced a set of, I think, 25 megatrends, 125 microtrends within those. There are 7 core basic needs of a city and 50 emerging technologies which may actually affect a city going forward. And some of the stuff we were coming up with was actually kind of looking at things that are going on in society now. So what's going on with things like the Me Too campaign, and actually how does that reflect society, and how is that, if we take that to its nth degree, how could that affect a city going forward? What would that actually impact on us? And also one of the cool ones, which was I think the client's favourite one and the team's favourite one, was called Techsy, which is tech is the new sexy. And that's all about kind of looking at the changing view of people working in tech as well as technology. So it's gone from kind of a world where, yeah, I love that one. It's kind of gone from a world where people are like, you know, technology is not necessarily glamorous, it's not necessarily something that people want to be involved in. And now everyone wants to be involved in tech. Everyone's like super excited about it. It's becoming one of those sort of more glamorous careers. And you see things in Silicon Valley, like just the changing face of the tech famous, the tech elite, I guess, as well, is kind of a core indicator of that as well. So we combined all of those pieces together. This is kind of the model that you use to combine it, and we did it in terms of a workshop. So we have lots of different cards, we'll take them, we'll get people to ideate on them, generate ideas. So if you guys have ever done anything like a design thinking workshop, it was very similar to that, but very structured around trends specifically. And from there, we've sort of come up with a model where there are, I think, 8 or so emerging futures for cities, and they're all kind of based on these different possible future scenarios. So it's kind of still in the works at the moment, but it's a really exciting project that I thought I would sort of mention with you. So I hope that kind of gives you a good idea of the different ways that you can actually use particularly design research to influence the work that you're kind of doing, and why it's important to actually have that bigger world view. So in terms of this, it's all about the context. So when you combine the different types together, you get the context. We know that we need to be able to tell the truth with the data that we're collecting, so that's making sure that we have the stories behind it and we're actually reflecting a true view of people's feelings and not necessarily obfuscating them through data. It always needs to be kind of, you need to think more like an investigator or a journalist, and you're kind of there, you're like Louis Theroux, basically, and you're there to kind of understand how people are there. You're not to judge, you're not to like influence them at all, but you're there to kind of gather that information from them. And it always needs to be an actionable insight, so it always has to drive your process forward. And when you're hypothesizing testing, you need to remember the ethical standards. So you almost need to think in terms of other scientific disciplines. What are the standards that they put in place when they're performing experiments? And is actually what you're doing, would that conform to those same standards? So yeah, it's effectively a multi-team model. So if we put data, trends, and design sort of thinking together, we get a much more powerful view of exactly what people need and the way that we can tackle it. Cool. That's it. Thank you. Yeah, sure. I probably spoke incredibly quickly, which is a bad habit.
Can you say a bit more? There was a note about pestle analysis.
Oh, yep, sure. So, yep. So that is, so pestle analysis is actually looking across the whole kind of world, or the world that your client is living in. So in terms of the politics, which is the P, you're looking at what political effects may actually change their business model. So things like Brexit, how changing views are, the rise of the extreme right and the extreme left, and actually how does that affect where you're sitting within society. Economics-wise, it may be things like the credit crunch, or is there kind of, in real terms, are people richer or poorer than they are today? How are people thinking about money? Social-wise, it's actually looking at things. I think one of the other ones we were looking at was around CrossFit being the new church. So people always have a search for belonging, but they're actually finding it in very different places now than they were previously. So obviously, we previously had religious institutions. Now people are gravitating, particularly in big cities, towards other types of belonging. Tech-wise, there's obviously emerging technologies, so whether that's kind of stuff that's all the way fully integrated, so IoT and the possibility of AI and how that could actually affect building systems. So can you generate a city on the fly? Can you actually build modular systems that would change a building? So a building could have one purpose at one point. You could use different types of technology to actually repurpose it and even reuse it. So I think in Finland they have a thing where you can book civic spaces and anyone's allowed to do it. So effectively it becomes a multi-purpose, multi-use space, and suddenly you've repurposed a building for a lot more people and opened up a lot more actual space for people to work in. Legal, so that would be different parts of legislation that may be affecting you. So GDPR, is that going to affect things like we're going? And the environment. So there we saw the rise of greenwashing. So that's something where it's companies appearing to do things that are green. And it's almost, there was like a rise of CSR maybe like 10 years ago, people doing corporate social responsibility. Now that's kind of focused on green efforts and being made to look like you're doing things for the environment, and you're not necessarily looking at the longer term effects of what you're doing. So I think there's stuff like people are using tote bags, but actually tote bags are more negative to the environment than they are positive. So it's actually understanding I think I've got that one right, but it's kind of things like that that have a consequence, and making sure that if you frame those all up, how does that then affect the work that you're doing? Cool.
Thank you very much.
Cool, no worries.